If you've kept up at all with the alleged controversies with Rings of Power, is how this does and does not link up with the Lord of the Rings as directed by Peter Jackson. And I knew as soon as this story came out that there's going to be a lot of paranoid commentaries about what this means or doesn't mean for Rings of Power. So let's get right to it. What has happened? Well, essentially, Peter Jackson was offered to join the team of Rings of Power, and he said, well, I really can't commit to anything. Can you please show me a script? We'll show you the script when it becomes available. And that's it. They never really contacted him afterward, and that's the end of the story. So there are a lot of ways to interpret this. One is that Amazon itself is hostile to Peter Jackson. They never really wanted to work with him. And on Amazon's side of the table, it's a little bit more complicated. There were pro Jackson people in Amazon, but apparently some of them left. So the people who were pressing to have Jackson join the team weren't there anymore. And apparently the other people were either hostile or indifferent to Jackson giving input. And that's it. So it just could be a financial business thing. It's also interesting that this could be the Tolkien estate because, as is well known, Christopher Tolkien really didn't like Peter Jackson. He really didn't like the interpretation in Lord of the Rings. He really didn't like the way The Hobbit turned out. So he was fairly hostile to the way Peter Jackson did things. Ironically, some people in the Tolkien estate actually were much more open minded, like Simon Tolkien, who was actually working with Amazon, and he actually had no major problems with Peter Jackson or the way he actually did the films. He actually thought they were flawed because they were a little too close to the texts. So it's kind of a mixed bag either way. It could be this is Amazon itself acting, or it could be the Tolkien estate just made it a stipulation of them doing the agreement that Peter Jackson would not be involved. Again, we just don't know. We need more details on how the contracts were negotiated and why they ultimately decided not to work with Peter Jackson. But there are ties to Lord of the Rings in terms of the film trilogy. We have people who worked on those films working with Amazon. We have Howard Shore. We have the Weta Workshop with Peter Jackson. That's why the Balrog looks so similar to the one in Lord of the Rings. And we also have some other personnel who worked on the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, and they're working with Amazon on this project. But again, I know some people are going to now be very suspicious of why they didn't more proactively seek out Peter Jackson's approval. Again, in terms of the books, this doesn't really matter. You can definitely draw up a conspiracy theory that if Peter Jackson was involved, he might have protested or put a stop to the more questionable elements in Rings of Power. But again, we're just speculating. Whether Peter Jackson would have even cared what the script was or the narrative was, we don't even know that. It could be he would have completely endorsed what they did with Rings of Power, and a lot of the fandom would be angry with him. So, part of the fandom seems to hold out the hope that Peter Jackson somehow wrote The Lord of the Rings, somehow he is J.R.R. Tolkien, somehow he created Middle Earth all by himself. This kind of weird George Lucas myth with Peter Jackson that a lot of the fandom wants to impose on him, which he himself is not really claiming. He's not claiming he hates Amazon or he dislikes what they're doing with Rings of Power. He just is telling his side of the story, and Amazon is saying it's a little bit more complex. So ultimately, there may not really be anything here. They decided to try to work with one another, and then they changed their minds. Why they changed their minds, though, we don't know the full story yet. But so they did try to feel out Peter Jackson, but ultimately it didn't go anywhere. I would add, it is a little strange they didn't even bother at least showing him a script, but who knows? It could have been a legal, financial thing. They didn't want any of the script being leaked. They were just worried about copyright and trademark issues. Again, those are real issues because Warner Brothers does own Lord of the Rings. People think Peter Jackson somehow has control of LOTR. He does not. Warner Brothers owns this property, so perhaps this is an Amazon versus Warner Brothers issue, and Peter Jackson is just sort of caught in the crossfire, to be fair to him. But we really don't know. I wanted to put this out there because I know some people think you're always shilling for Amazon. You only show the good side of Amazon, Peter Jackson, blah, blah, blah. Well, despite what people think, yes, I do sometimes report the news. I don't just make stuff up like certain other outlets. Make of it what you will, whether it was a good or bad decision. But yes, they did try to work with Peter Jackson, but ultimately it just didn't work out. Whether this bespeaks anything of the authenticity or the narrative integrity of what we're going to see ultimately with Rings of Power, we're going to have to wait and see. But that's the story, at least for now, of Peter Jackson versus Rings of Power. And there we are.